Every taxi operator, when they get into the bus every morning, knows they need to make a lot of money, and they also need to get everyone to and from work as safely as they can. And they know that they have to balance that in their decision making all the time. And a lot of business in the Anglo-American sphere has been divorced from that. We don't think about what it means to impact society with what we do by making profit. And I find that firms, and particularly small firms, have that fused much more.
Welcome to Season 2 of Our Long Walk, a podcast series about South Africa's past, present and future. I'm Johan Fourie from Stellenbosch University, and as always, I'm joined by Wits University's brilliant Jonathan Schoots.
With Johan's expertise in economic history and my expertise in historical sociology, we are excited to interview world-leading academics who ask compelling questions about our country, our continent, and the ideas shaping the world around us. Christopher Eaglin is an assistant professor in the strategy area at the Fuqua School of Business at Duke University. He investigates how entrepreneurs set strategy in uncertain environments, how entrepreneurship environments are governed, and more broadly, how firm strategy setting impacts the building of inclusive and sustainable economies.
He has a PhD in business strategy from Harvard, and before academia, he worked in the non-profit sector, consulting, and for Fortune 500 companies, developing services in the US, UK, Brazil, and South Africa. Welcome, Jonathan, and welcome, Chris.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
And the little one, I want to say welcome as well.
Her name is Matilda. She's joining us on Dad's Chest.
Chris, we are going to talk a lot about the minibus taxi industry in South Africa. So I thought perhaps to start, just explain to our international listeners what the South African taxi industry is like, perhaps a bit of the history and also just about its current practices.
The typical taxi is a white box, 16-seater combi van. They operate from 5 a.m. till 10 p.m. What I think is beautiful about the taxi industry is it replaces trains, buses, taxis, plane service for the people who use them. If you went into the central Joburg Park rank, you literally could get to anywhere in Southern Africa from that rank. It might take you a couple days, but you could get there, and you could get there much cheaper than if you did it any other way. If you wanted to go to Malawi, there would be a taxi that would leave sometime that week that would get you there. If you want to go to Angola, the taxi industry could get you there. It is a really beautiful, profound thing that the taxi industry does, all in these sort of 16-seater minivan buses. The taxi industry has a very particular history. It comes from apartheid spatial segregation policies where, the Black population was moved out of city centers and still needed to come into work, but requisite infrastructure wasn't built for them to do that. And so the taxi industry came up as a way for the local community to help each other get to work. And it has always had this community spirit. Because there wasn't a lot of economic opportunity within townships, it became really coveted. So people saw it as one of the few ways to get up the income ladder. And that became violent over time because there were just so few opportunities. And so what you really should think about when you see the industry is this very profound, ingenious community response to an oppressive apartheid legacy. It was imperfect, and it has challenges still today, but it provides this fantastic ability to get people who weren't supposed to survive to and from work and provide a lot of economic opportunity for them. And so when you're international coming in, you'll see the speeding, you'll see the crashes, but you won't see, or you may not perceive, this enormous, beautiful, community resilient response that the taxi industry is providing.
Chris, for someone who's never taken a taxi here in South Africa, why is this industry such a revealing place to learn about entrepreneurship and the economy?
That's a really great question, jumping right into it. Let me give you a little bit of background about myself. In some of that corporate work that you mentioned before I got my PhD, I lived in South Africa for 5 years. Particularly, I lived in Cape Town, and I did work with development broadly, and I did some work with the taxi industry when I was there as a consultant. I was really immediately fascinated by the complexity of the industry. Here you had this private set of operators providing a really important essential service. And over time, it seems that they've been doing it maybe not to the highest set of quality that we would like, but certainly better than power, water, education, particularly for the disadvantaged population in South Africa, right? Like if you think about if you're a Black person in South Africa at the present moment, the service that you know you can rely on every day is the taxis. You cannot rely on getting water every day. You can't rely on getting electricity every day. You certainly cannot be sure that when you send your kids to school, they will learn much. But you do know that you can get to and from work and you can transport people. And that is as a result of this industry. And I find that very fascinating. I also find it really fascinating that when you think about the taxi industry from a traditional economic theory or management strategy theory lens, it sort of defies logic. When I often present this, I call the industry an anomaly because we think that a strong entrepreneurial environment needs to have a steady set of regulations, low cost of capital, high ability to enter, definitely low levels of violence and intimidation. None of those things are the case in the taxi industry. Literally none of them. They provide this really essential service, and in a space where unemployment for Black youth in South Africa is astronomically high, it is one of the most consistent employers and fonts of entrepreneurship. If you talk to many Black South Africans, it is not uncommon that someone in the room has family connections to the taxi industry, that the taxi industry has funded their education, funded bursaries for them, funded scholarships, funded businesses for them. It's just sort of pervasive. In addition to that, as you and I well know, if it were not for the taxi industry, you wouldn't be able to get a cup of coffee, your kids wouldn't be able to go to school, no building would turn on, no factory would get running, no materials would ever make it out of the mine if it weren't for them. And so for all these reasons, I find it really fascinating from both a practical, policy, and theoretic lens. On top of that, I got really fortunate that I got fantastic data from a lending company that when I was still a PhD student, I don't know how I got them to do this, but I convinced them to give me all the spatial data. And I was able to learn quite a bit from them. And so, I mean, this is a long-winded answer, but I think it gives, I was very fortunate to have really granular data. It's a really fascinating industry within South Africa, and more broadly, although there are particularities about the industry in South Africa, they're not uncommon to other transport services around the globe. 1 billion people every year get into these sort of informal transports, and lots of them are structured in similar kinds of ways. That's millions of firms that have these same kind of dynamics. And more broadly, when you think about SMEs that find themselves in uncertain environments, there are a lot of characteristics that they similarly face. Maybe they don't have the same sort of violence or difficulty entering or operating, but they face capital constraints, they face uncertainty about the macro regime, they face uncertain product markets, shifting consumer demand without a lot of protection from supporting institutions. And so that way, the taxi industry has broad applicability to other SMEs in uncertain spaces, from my perspective.
Before I give Jonathan a chance to ask a follow-up question, because I can see he's very keen to do so, I just wanted to inform the listeners that if Chris gives the wrong answer, then Matilda, his young daughter, is there to correct him. So if you hear any other noises, then that's Matilda interjecting to add her 2 cents. Jonathan.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, it's such a kind of beautiful big picture answer. There's so much that I'm eager to dive into there, but let me pick one piece to start off with, which is, you know, the taxi industry is kind of renowned for breaking traffic laws, skipping red lights or driving on the shoulder or zooming here and there. And I hear so often so many people kind of grumbling about this as a kind of lawlessness. But one of your pieces here, I really liked the way that you kind of shift perspective for an average South African, where you shift to see the kind of whole system and how it creates certain sets of pressures and rewards for what you term strategic misconduct. In the opening of that piece, you point to how some literature has talked about things like lack of regulation, like the need to compete in a crowded, complicated space. But in that piece, you really look at financial constraints and how financial constraints drive this need for strategic misconduct. So could you tell us a little bit more about that, how you see capital constraints shaping this kind of speeding and crashing in taxis? You've got this beautiful data. Tell us a little bit more also about how you're actually seeing this in such beautiful detail.
Really great question. This was my first paper for my dissertation, my job market paper. It's the one that got me the job. I love this paper for so many reasons. It happens to be the thing that when you go and ask taxi drivers what their biggest constraint is, everyone tells you this is what they complain about. The cost of capital, the affordability of having their bus is really high. They get a bad rap, which is deserved for running lights or running robots in parlance, getting on the shoulder, getting to accidents, but they are under intense pressure to earn back their capital. It's a very complicated problem. So if you think about it from a lender's perspective, how do you assess the risk of a minibus taxi owner operator? That's not an easy question. There's not a lot of good data about these guys for a whole bunch of reasons that you all have explored and in your research and elsewhere. The credit markets are really thin for the disadvantaged population in South Africa. So giving them low interest rates is hard from a traditional financing perspective. The things that you would look for, they're just not there. Then let's also be honest, like these folks have guns, and do you really feel comfortable giving people who have guns really low interest rates? Probably not. So you find yourself in a position where lending at rates that seem reasonable is really hard to justify. Really, really hard to justify. And so you end up with this, I'll call it trifurcation of the market. You have the big five banks who will lend to your best minibus taxi operators, right? These are people who've been in the industry a long time. They have perfect credit, and they'll get loans between 12 and 18%. I'd stay still on the high side, but reasonable, something that you could achieve. That's like 10, 15% of the market. So then there's this middle market, we'll call it like 50, 60%, and this is where I get my data from a lender, where there are people who could pay you back, but their credit worthiness is unknown. They have some markers that would lead you to think that they could be good credit, and they have other markers that would lead you to believe that they wouldn't be. But they're in this industry where they can make money and they have some cash. And so you say, okay, well, I feel comfortable lending to you, but I only feel comfortable lending to you at much higher rates. And those higher rates means that the amount that these operators have to pay in to the lender every month is really high. For them, 15,000, 16,000, 17,000 and more rand a month it's a lot of money. If you imagine that on average, a local operator will earn between 40 and 50,000 rand a month. They have to pay the driver, they have to pay the association fee, they have to pay maintenance, they have to pay fuel, and then they have to pay like 18,000 rand to the loan operator. That creates really thin margins to operate. If you don't have a lot of ways to make additional income, the way you're going to do it is you're going to speed. You're going to try to get as many people into the bus as you can, and you're going to try to get as many trips in as you can. And that's really going to bite towards the end of the month when those loan payments are due, over holidays when people are going back and forth, and that tends to be when we see a lot of the accidents. And so there's just a really clear economic logic going on about why they're operating in this kind of way. And as I started this, if you go and ask them, this is the first thing they'll tell you. There are a number of reports that SADC has done, that other reports have done about what are the primary challenges to the industry, and top of the list is capital constraints, always. So this is a known problem, and they will tell you that this is what forces them to speed. And lo and behold, when you have really granular data, that's exactly what we see. So my job market paper is really just based on this basic correlation that when I graph speeding against interest rates, the higher the interest rate, the more they speed. And then I do some fancy econometrics about, well, do we think that's causal? And I think I can mostly convince you that probably it is, but that correlation is undeniable. And so when you think about these behaviors that we don't like from the taxi industry, A lot of it is structural. What I have tried to convince the lender and other lenders in this space is if we can be creative about the way in which we do credit and lower the affordability component, the data says that you're going to get better performance from these guys, and there'll be a big social uplift as well.
I find that quite fascinating because traditionally economists would say that easy credit encourages risky behavior. And yet your finding is almost exactly the opposite, that it's like the very expensive credit that can push firms into kind of dangerous misconduct. This is obviously kind of risky behavior, but this is both accidents and therefore deaths, are affected. But I wondered to what extent you've thought about traffic, to what extent would the behavior be shaped also by South Africa's just like incredibly clogged roads? Is that not another channel which we can shape, or we can use a policy in some policy way to shape behavior?
Yeah, this is a great point, and this goes to a broader perspective. There's no dedicated infrastructure from a state perspective for the taxi industry to a first approximation. I mean, there's some, but there really isn't. And that's a huge problem. So one of the reasons they go on the shoulder or go over the median or whatnot is because they're trying to get people to work and they're stuck in traffic and they have people in the back saying, please get me to work. When unemployment's like 67% for this population, you don't show up to work 1 or 2 days, you're fired. And it's just really easy to replace you. These operators are under an enormous amount of pressure to get their clients, to get those passengers to jobs on time. And there's no dedicated infrastructure for them. There are no bus lanes. There's no right of way. There's no thought for congestion for them. And so they're trying to provide this public service without really much support. And so that's why you get this sort of real crunch. I mean, the thing that I will say is I think we can all agree that they operate in a second best world. A first best world is there is state planning, there's a subsidy, there are clear labor laws, there are regulations, there's schedules like what you'd have from a bus service in New York or London or whatnot. That is not what we have. And so in the absence of that, I think the industry has been extremely entrepreneurial and creative in filling that gap, but it is what an ideal social planner would not create. And the things that you've brought up, the capital constraints and the infrastructure really speak to that.
Yeah. Some of the numbers you have from this paper, a 1% decrease in interest rates leads to a 10 to 15% decrease in speeding alerts and a 9% decrease in crashes. There's something really interesting here because just as you've been saying now, there is a context here, a kind of broader context in many spaces in the world where there's a context of, and I quote, immense competition, weak regulatory oversight, and severe institutional voids. So I wonder what you think about in terms of spaces to intervene, right? Because here you're showing they're decreasing this kind of pressure that comes from the kind of crunch of it's the end of the month and I have to pay back my loans. You just see this real severe impact on speeding and on crashes. But also you're kind of talking here about some contexts that are deeply systemic and really difficult to change, like 60% unemployment for people under 30. And that means that the people who are driving have a massive reason to be the best because there's huge competition. It means the people who are being driven need to get to work or they're going to get fired. How do you think about intervening in a space like this, right? Is there some way to think about the systemic level here and the context that are shaping it to make the pressure less?
Yeah, again, really fantastic question. One that I've wrestled with a lot, and I've come to some, maybe in the South African policy space, more unorthodox solutions. When you think about affordability and these capital constraint problems, best thing that policy could do would be to give the industry a subsidy. People don't like that. They're like, we don't want to fund the gang, which you would be doing. Let's just be honest. We don't want to fund people who clog our roads, kill people, all that kind of stuff. But it happens to be that these people are the people who make the South African economy go. And if you want them to do it sustainably in a better fashion, you need to pay them for that service that they're providing. And the government's getting a free ride by not doing that. And what they're doing is they're allowing the backs of really poor South Africans to cover this core economic function, which is fundamentally unfair. So government really should step in and start providing some sort of subsidy for minibus taxi operators. It would alleviate a lot of these capital constraint pressures because at least they had some sort of baseline income to provide the service, which is really important from a social perspective. You would also be able to reach into the bus and be more prescriptive about the kind of behavior that you would want. So you could say, in exchange for the subsidy, I need to be able to track your behavior. If you do X, Y, and Z, you will lose your subsidy. I can tell you that another reason I love this industry is talking to minibus taxi operators. They're like the most hardcore capitalist people I've ever met in my life. They would give Elon Musk a run for his money. Like, it's just, it's really deep and profound with them. And so they really understand the changes in the financial economic levers. And so if you incentivize them to do certain things and it works for their overall cost structure, they'll change. That's what the data says. I have this experiment where we, in essence, lower their monthly payments and we see like all sorts of improvements in their behavior as a result of that. And even the financier is really surprised. They're like, oh, these guys are just hoarding cash. They're not going to pay me back. And it turns out they're just really capital constrained, which is what they tell you. And so if you can alleviate that, and then you start reaching into the bus and saying, well, I've alleviated this for you. I need your workers to have, better health care, or we need to provide, we need to monitor the bus in a certain way so that if it does more than X amount of speeding alerts or gets in so many crashes, like it has to come off, or like you will lose your license or your subsidy if you behave in this sort of way. It allows you a lot more span of control, which the government in essence doesn't have at the moment.
You've mentioned a paper where you do this experiment, but I want to go back to another paper or a chapter, I'm not entirely sure, in the PhD, where you do this kind of natural experiment during COVID, which is kind of similar to what you've just explained, where you've got some associations which allow kind of more flexible routes or switch routes. Is that exactly the kind of thing that where it seems like people are reacting to these incentives?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what's really interesting, and one of the reasons I became a strategy management scholar, is it doesn't matter where you go. If you have good management, your performance increases. Outside of this scenario, there's this really wonderful paper by a series of political scientists at Chicago on Brazilian gangs that demonstrate that gangs that have better management practices not only are better run, but the people that serve have better services overall. And that was the impetus for this paper, just thinking about like, well, even though we might dislike a lot of the components of associations, does better management practice amongst them lead to better performance? And in COVID, it definitely does. It doesn't, they can't undo COVID, but they certainly were able to blunt the effect. Members, the ones that were more flexible, came up with equitable route selection, made sure that the routes weren't clogged, that even at the margin, you get a really big uptick in survivor.
Matilda seems to agree.
She does.
On the point of management then, so what is it that makes a good manager? Is it training? Is it experience? Are you born with it? How do you identify these good managers versus bad ones?
Okay, so this is like the $1 million question. There are a whole field of scholars who don't know. They have like a good sense. What I've seen with the associations, these are fundamentally unions. And there are some good things that you can draw down from like union literature about what leads to better practice or not. More equitable seniority rules, clear conflict resolution rules, clear bookkeeping rules, free and fair elections within the associations, peaceful transfer of power. These are really basic things, but they set a foundation for better management practice. Now, I don't have data on this with the associations. This is just qualitatively what I've seen, but that accords with what a lot of research on unions would suggest.
I want to come back to this question or this kind of suggestion of, can we offer a subsidy? Can you come in here and contribute something and maybe regulate in the process? To link into another paper that you've done titled Easy Doesn't Do It, where you show that there is immense competition in this taxi space. And in fact, those who are faced with challenges early on have to develop a set of strategic practices that actually enable them to survive and thrive, kind of forcing you into key strategic decision making early on. I want to talk about that paper a little bit more, but first I want to kind of think with the idea that you talk about people who are really struggling to access credit, but some people out there are going out and getting their 25 or 30% loan and breaking into the industry at this incredible difficulty, but really you have this immensely competitive environment where whatever edge is going to get you there. But some people are starting really in a difficult position, but finding ways to make it work, right? And this is intense competition that is really finding every edge. But because of that, because there's such a fierce environment or so much kind of need, you generate maximally optimal taxi driving, even when maximally optimal is run the light or crash a couple of times. So all of that is to say, does subsidy blunt that incredibly competitive space? And does your other work, which shows how being in a kind of facing difficulty early on develops the need for that fundamental strategic engagement?
Yeah, it's really interesting. That paper was one that I famously say I didn't like. Right? I was investigating the data and I kept getting this result and I spent months trying to kill it, like really kill it. And then I went to my supervisors and I was like, I found this result. It doesn't make any sense. And they're like, well, let's build a little model. And then they said, why don't you go and talk to people? Like, do you really think that this is the case? And lo and behold, when I talk to people and I understand the logic of what happens when you get started, it makes a lot of sense. By the way, when I went and told operators that this is the result, they hated it. They're like, it is not true. I was like, what the data says. But I think what's really fascinating about that is some deeper points about what it means to be an entrepreneur. Being an entrepreneur in an uncertain environment is hard. It's just hard. And if you are not willing to put your nose to the grindstone, work really hard, and adopt like high work strategic actions, you're not going to survive. And what I love about that paper is it says that you need to do that no matter where you are. If you are in the South African taxi industry, if you are in the top of tech, if you are in an incubator in Israel or India, like that is true everywhere. And that's in essence what that paper says. The strategies that you set have a first order implication on how successful you'll be. And in an environment where the pressure is intense, you are not immune from that. It is more important for you to do so. So what that suggests is helping operators develop high work strategies, thoughtfulness in terms of how they go about operating their buses. It's the first order thing that you'd want to do. I would love to decrease the pressure overall in the industry. I think it's delivering us some not great outcomes. Providing subsidy, providing more relaxed credit might decrease some of this sort of high work environment, and that'll create another set of perverse incentives. But I'd rather deal with those than the ones I currently have.
One thing I also really loved in that paper is it really you highlight here that perhaps the kind of management and strategy literature still has like a lot to learn from looking at these small and medium-sized enterprises, still has a lot to learn from turning to emerging markets, to these kind of understudied areas and populations. And so this is not my kind of area, and I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about what the kind of mainstream focus in management and strategy literature, and particularly how focusing on these small to medium-sized enterprises and focusing on contexts like sub-Saharan Africa kind of pushes that field or that set of ways of thinking forward.
So I'm going to try to be as kind to my field as possible before I go into this critique. I think that my field thinks deeply about a really important problem, which is why is it that the same kind of firm with the same kind of resources will have very different kind of outcomes? And why do we see that across lots of different spaces? What does that mean for firm success? What does that mean for firm advice? What does that mean further down the line to delivering the products and services that we'd like to see? I think that my field has primarily studied that amongst high resource firms and entrepreneurs. There are good reasons for that. That's where a lot of the data is. This research got started in the 70s and 80s. There just wasn't good data on small firms, particularly not small firms in emerging markets. What you had is like CompuStat, S&P 500, Moody's. That's what they used, and made inferences, and a lot of theories that we have are built on those data sets. Those data sets are not representative of the majority of firms in the world. By count, SMEs are 90% of firms. They represent anywhere between 50 to 70% of employment and up to 40 to 50% of GDP. And so when you sample on firms that are not characteristically like the majority of firms out there, you just get distortions anyway. That's like the classic economic problem. You have a sample selection problem. What does that mean for what you can actually say? My field has a sample selection problem where we developed all our theories based on a delimited set of firms and the problems that those delimited set of firms have. If your theory only works for firms that have $1 billion or access to $1 billion or more, like you described those firms very well, but I question whether like it extends to everybody else. And my research project or agenda more generally is to say, hey, field, if we want to be broadly applicable and useful, we've really got to start considering firms that are outside of our bubble. We're in this great place of unknowing. I don't know. Who knows? Maybe not. And so I think what's interesting about the papers that I have so far is I say in some cases that is absolutely the case. So in the misconduct paper, the challenge of getting that over the line was to convince the field that the theories that we have about how misconduct happened do not apply here. And with the other paper, it was like the theories we have about entrepreneurship do apply here. And I think broadening how we think about the applicability of our theories is really important. This also has this downstream effect of when I talk to small firms, when I talk to even large firms in emerging markets, they often say the theories that you all have developed don't apply to me. I don't feel they work. This is something that I've heard over and over again. If we have a stable operating environment and I can go to the bank, get a loan, and I can go buy the next entrepreneur who has a great product, like what you're saying makes sense. But if I don't have those things or it's much more complicated, what do I do? And I feel the field of management strategy is left twiddling its thumbs a lot more than we should. And I would love to push the boundaries of that, to be able to say to firms in South Africa, in India, in China, we have something really important to share with you about how you can be more strategic, how you can be profitable given the constraints that you face. And we don't have really good answers about what to do about that. And I argue that going and talking to firms that are already dealing with balancing their social requirements and their financial requirements is a good starting place to understand how do you manage that. I mean, that's one of the reasons I love the taxi industry. Every taxi operator, when they get into the bus every morning, knows they need to make a lot of money, and they also need to get everyone to and from work as safely as they can. And they know that they have to balance that in their decision making all the time. And a lot of like business in the Anglo-American sphere has been divorced from that. Like we don't think about what it means to impact society with what we do by making profit. And I find that firms, and particularly small firms, have that fused much more. If we want to learn or relearn how to do that, that's a good place for us to start getting examples again.
I think that's incredibly powerful, this kind of theoretical contribution. I want to segue into also your kind of methodological contribution, because I think your work really uses unusually rich data, right? Kind of new data, GPS traces from vehicles, detailed loan records, and also kind of lots of qualitative interviews. What kinds of economic questions about South Africa, the taxi industry, but broader than that, South Africa, Africa, are we able to answer with all of this new kind of data that we couldn't perhaps do with the limited surveys and official statistics that we have?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so much more that we can learn. So in the management and science paper, the strategic misconduct paper, I note early on that we have this problem in misconduct research that we actually don't measure misconduct. We measure third, fourth, fifth iteration down. We don't actually see what happens when someone does misconduct. We see when it explodes into something bad, and then that is reported. And because there's a lot of contamination in that process, it disallows us to really understand what's happening under the hood and design policies that might address it. And so I think it's just really powerful to have more granular data because you actually get a sense to see, well, what's actually going on with this phenomena. And one of the reasons I did all this qualitative work, I am not a qualitative scholar. I do not claim to be that. That's not how I was trained. I had to do it because I didn't understand what the data was telling me. And this is what I've really encouraged other people in my field, my students, other PhD students to do. Like, I think the hallmark of a really good researcher is understanding the data generating process in a very deep way. How do data points enter your data set? How do they operate within your data set? And how do they exit your data set? In some cases, we know that pretty easily. It's well described. In other cases, like we don't know that at all. And that's not just for the data that I work with. I think there are a lot of data sets that we make a lot of assumptions about that we don't unpack under the hood actually what's going on. Like in my field, we spend lots and lots of times working with patents. At least in the US, I'm not sure that most scholars, I won't say all, but I think most scholars have actually taken the time to think about what actually happens in the patenting process and what kind of selection is going on and what does that mean for what you're actually studying versus the broader space of intellectual property. And I think if you think about that broader space of intellectual property, you get different kinds of answers. And that's what I'm trying to demonstrate with this research with the taxi industry. It's not enough just to say, here's some correlations or here's my best bet at exogeneity and estimation. You really got to know what's going on under the hood. And that, I think, generates better theory, better results, and better implications. Taking the sort of like full-fisted approach of there's a lot of data out there, I'm not going to be afraid to go and use it. If I can't do it, I'm going to get people who know how to use it and then try to put it together into some sort of compelling story is really important. And that's a sort of like a methodological agenda that I have, really pushing people, myself first and foremost, but others in the field to think hard about what data do we have? What does that say? And how can we extrapolate that to our case, to what we're thinking from a theoretical perspective? And does it upend what we have learned now that we have better data or we're more honest about the way in which we go about dealing with the data than we might have been before?
I really have liked in this discussion something that resonates for me, how you're painting this picture of, in the South African context, the kinds of pressures that are shaping business, that are shaping employment, that can be really constraining firms as they're emerging in this entrepreneurial space, as well as, exactly as you've said, thinking about these really difficult contexts, or in fact contexts that are very prevalent all over the world for many small to medium enterprises all over emerging markets. But to be a little bit like kind of South Africa selfish here, do you, in light of all of this, do you have thoughts about how to promote business growth and, how to kind of link government regulation and business growth and, how to really kind of take a constrained context a step forward in a way that really can benefit the South African business environment for entrepreneurs? Are there some key things that can be low-hanging fruit that can really improve things?
Isn't that the question?
Yeah.
Having clear, thoughtful, and well-enforced regulation is irreplaceable. I think first and foremost, what business needs is certainty. And certainty over a long period of time. Business, a long period of time is not 25 years. 5 years is plenty. 10 years is delightful. But enough that entrepreneurs of all stripes can feel comfortable investing capital, opening up markets, delivering service, and feel that they're going to get a reasonable return. I'm not saying go build a new plant. I'm not saying go build a new water facility. I'm not saying deploy a new initiative about cleaning up crime. None of those things. Pick a set of policies, let those policies be relatively thoughtful and stick to them. Because at least I know 5 years from now, 10 years from now, in X space, in the digital space, in the energy space, in the road space, for the most part, things are going to be the same. And if I have dispute, it will be adjudicated in a way that I can trust. You can take the people who have now and you can more or less convince them that this is the way we should move forward. That would be the first thing. The second thing is, of course, getting basic infrastructure right. I think the South African government has a hard time choosing. It doesn't have infinite funds. It doesn't have infinite capacity. And picking one or two things that they're going to go all in on to fix and work through and fund appropriately is better than a scattershot. If I could offer two things, it would be focus and regulatory clarity. I think those would make huge difference.
I couldn't agree more. I think the one positive thing to say is that there is now a Operation Vulindlela that is exactly about focus, right? It's got these different things that it wants to address first and then move on to kind of second and third order things. And it does seem to have made a difference in the last year or so. So hopefully those hopes become true. We need to get to the end of the conversation, but there's still a very important thing to do. But before I get there, I want to link the AI-generated music that's going to follow, with a question about innovation and technology. So the one thing that I think, as an economic historian, of course, given the recent Nobel Prize that went to Joel Mokyr on his contribution to innovation in history, and Paul Howard and Philip Aghion on innovation, I wonder about innovation and productivity growth in the taxi industry. How should I think about that? You've mentioned actually that it's an incredibly competitive industry, and actually when margins are so low, there's no obviously chance really to kind of risk with new innovations, I don't know, electric vehicles or whatever you might think of as a way to innovate. How should we think about innovation in this industry?
It's interesting. I think it is not true that the taxi industry is not innovative. I think they're innovative in ways that are unseen and at smaller scale than you would see in other industries. But this is creating a real divergence in profitability and going back to management practice among associations. So the best run associations deploy a lot of digital technologies. They have cameras that count buses. They have their own GPS devices on those buses. They enforce monitoring and non-compliance through these more electronic means. They are starting to introduce digital payments. They have Wi-Fi in the vehicles. They are thinking about branding buses. I think there is a segment of the market that is really trying to think about, well, how do we use these new technologies? And I'm also working on a project that's thinking about how can we use solar and how can we do electrification? I think part of the challenge is there's just not a lot of capital to try these things in a broad way within the industry. So they tend to be constrained, but I don't think there's a lack of interest in innovation. The level of education is low. Innovation is something that one builds on. It's a series of building blocks and it goes in different directions as we build on it together. When level of education is low, it means that a lot of the innovation comes from external sources. And so that can be costly and goes to those firms or associations that have the highest resources. And the level of adoption through the industry is going to be lower as well. So it's not right to say that there isn't innovation in the industry. It's constrained by lack of education and resource availability, but there is certainly interest. And large associations that have more resources have definitely invested in those sorts of things.
Chris, I'm going to play the song now. Matilda will also hopefully enjoy that. This is based on your 3 papers that I uploaded to ChatGPT. I asked for some Amapiano music, and so here goes.
I can't wait.
When the road gets hard, we still move the town. Give me little breathing space. Not a prison made of debt. Lower down my monthly wage. Watch me pay what I can pay. Cheaper credit, safer ride. See the taxi slow its pace. When the pressure's off my mind, you get profit, I get grace. Oh yeah. You get profit, I get grace. Oh yeah. Give me little breathing space. Oh yeah. In the taxi rank morning, tires on the top. Small business on 4 wheels, that's our car. No subsidy, no safety net, just lines on the map. And the lender on the phone saying mind that gap. When the interest climb, driver push that speed. Chasing one more trip, one more seat they need. Red light, late night, living on the edge. Risk on the road for the bank safe hedge. But cut that rate, you see hands relax. No need to fly, we've been breathing the tax. Same old route, but the vibe new clean. Less blue lights, fewer crosses on the scene. This is not bad apples, this is how we cope. When the system tight, people stretch the rope. Give us fair terms, we will play it straight. History's telling you, pressure makes us break. It's not just numbers in a line. This body's on the road at night. Change the deal, you change the drive. You keep the business in the life. Give me a little breathing space. Not a prison made of debt. Lower down my monthly wage. Watch me pay what I can pay. Cheaper credit, safer ride. See the taxi slow its pace. When the pressure's off my mind, you get profit, I get grace. Oh yeah. You get profit, I get grace. Oh yeah. Give me a little breathing space. Oh yeah. You give a luck down here, streets running thin, some routes empty. How you gonna win? One association say you must stay in your lane. Other one flex, let you switch in the rain. Flexible rules kept engines on. Rigid ones watched whole ranks be gone. Same city, same virus in here. Different rules, different futures there. Then the big man calls, we can help with your loan, but listen close to the interest tone. Cut my payment now, I can hustle and rise. Slash the total on the paper, that's just numbers in the sky. Cash flow king in the crisis phase. Give me smaller steps, I'll walk that maze. Strong firm stand when the terms are right. Weak ones fall even under soft light. Cool, it's not overhang, it's overload. Too much weight on a bumpy road. When you give me room, I choose the law. When you squeeze too hard, I break it more. From Josie taxis to Lagos rides. Same big lesson in the streets we drive. Fix the rules and fix the rate. See the future calibrate. Give me a little breathing space. Not a prison made.
Thoughts about that, Chris?
I loved it. I thought that was great.
We also end with a question from ChatGPT.
Okay.
Imagine you're an economic historian in 50 years' time, writing about African entrepreneurship in the early 21st century. What do you hope this economic historian would take from your work on taxis, credit, and crises? What is the big story you think we are living through right now that your work records?
Oh, wow. I have never thought of that question before. That's excellent. I hope that my work creates building blocks for us thinking about how to build inclusive economies. And I'm very hopeful that economic historian 50 years from now will see this work as part of a package that led to different sets of policies or more thoughtful policies that moved entrepreneurs in Africa and African economies in a more productive, better direction. I'm hoping that my work catalyzes that or helps push that forward. In 50 years' time, it would be great if an economic historian looked back and said, you know, Africa and entrepreneurship is a vibrant place, that we have all these wonderful firms. And isn't it great this early work helped us think about what are the things that we really need to do to develop policies? That would be fantastic.
Christopher Eaglin and Matilda, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
To all the listeners, thank you also. And we'll be back in a couple of weeks. In fact, we'll be back after the December holidays in South Africa. See you then. Goodbye. Thank you for listening to another episode of Season 2 of the Our Long Walk podcast. We'd love to hear from you. What's the one idea from today's conversation that changed your outlook? Do you have a burning question you'd like to explore, or perhaps a guest you'd love to hear from? Get in touch with us by sending an email to johan@ourlongwalk.com. That's JOHAN@ourlongwalk.com.
If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend. You can follow us on Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And we'd love your feedback. Visit us at ourlongwalk.com. Follow our LinkedIn page for updates, new episodes, and additional links.
This series is made possible by the Chair in Economics, History and Policy at Stellenbosch University. Visit leapstellenbosch.org for more information about our research unit in economic history.
Thanks to LEAP researcher Kelsey Lemon, who provided helpful background research. Thanks also to the team at Voice Note Productions for helping to make this podcast. Our producer is Vasti Calitz. Sound design and editing is done by Andri Burnett. Nkosi Johan.
Danke, Jonathan. Join us next time for another episode of Our Long Walk.
See you then.
Cheers.